Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and we are on a streak of what must be 4, 5 White Dwarfs in a row that have had Warcry content. It's a wonderful world to be living in, especially given that we have an expansion around the corner too. So the last White Dwarf had really exciting news for us because I wasn't thinking we would get the Harrowdeep rules until probably the next Tome of Champions. So the fact that they're here in this White Dwarf is amazing. And there's kind of a lot to talk about. So let's just dive right in, right? So the rules for Blackpowder's Buccaneers are here. Gorlock Blackpowder. So at first, he's going to kind of seem like a worse Thunderfist, and you pay 10 more points for him, right? Because, Thunderfist is sort of the legendary ogre's leader of the Lead Belchers, just one of the most dominant artillery pieces in the game. You see Gorlock, you're tempted to always just use that ranged ability if you've got it, and then Broadside for a triple turns Gorlock into a pretty scary artillery piece, but you're still doing a lot less than a Thunderfist would for 10 fewer points and just using a double. So you're kind of losing value in two different places. The thing you want with Gorlock is to be taking advantage of, he's actually got a pretty respectable little melee ability, or just damage profile, right? 4 attacks and then 3s and 6s on damage is really solid. So he's much more like, say, a worse Tyrant, where you're taking it for the melee and then it also has a little shooting attack, or more like a better Maneater, where it's also kind of halfway in between. These fighters with kind of two different attack profiles, if one of them's not amazing, these tend to get left out when it comes to competitive play. But I think for casual and narrative, I think Gorlock is very solid. Just note, like I said before, you're going to want to get him into fights and kind of only use the shooting ability when you have a triple to spare for Broadside. It can be something where it can be really nice if you're in a fight already, you use 1 attack to clear out whatever you're fighting, and then you use a triple to use Broadside, because that ability is just on 1 attack. Going into the Gnoblars, though, Pegs and KG are their names. Pegs is a much worse Gnoblar. Gnoblars are some of the best chaff in the game at 45 points. But he's got a nice ability to make up for it, and I'll get to that when we get to Mange. KG's range, not really needed in Maw Tribes. Ogre Maw Tribes might be one of the 3 or 4 best shooting armies in the entire game. So you don't really need that little more expensive Gnoblar with the 8-inch attack. So really, you're looking at the ability. You're keeping KG out of the fight already with the 8-inch range. Mange is often going to be running forward. KG is a lot less likely to be within that 6-inch range of Mange than than Pegs is. Their names are just very silly. So I'm not sure I would take KG. Pegs is fine if you like Mange, but KG I'm not as into. The pets are kind of funny, right? So Shriek is overcosted. Now, we could have an entire video just discussing what these points mean for the future of Warcry. One of them is, if you look at, we'll get to this when we talk about Xandire's Truthseekers, Shriek is way more expensive than Flyers have been in the past. It makes me wonder if the next TOC is going to be pretty tough on Flyers. Now, I've noted in previous videos that under the current Tome of Champions, of the 3-in-1 warbands at Adepticon, I was the only person not to have a flyer in my list. There were a lot of lists without flyers at the tournament. I was the only one that went 3-in-1 or better. Flyers are essentially, if you're not running spiders, or I'm counting Thundercats as flyers because of the 10-inch move. I know that that's not quite the same. But if you're not running spiders, you essentially need some of these 10-inch wound, super speedy flyers. And they seem to have noticed, which I guess is a good sign for the fact that, they either play their own game or they pay attention to their own game. I have not gotten any kind of indication from anyone at GW that they were paying attention to the Adepticon results, but oh boy, it does seem like they've noticed the Flyers are a little bit overtuned in their game. So Shriek is wildly overcosted, but Mange is kind of interesting. Mange has 5-inch move, very little hit points, just 6. But Mange has really solid damage output for that price, only 55 points, right? So at six wounds, you're not really devastated if they take out Mange. And then the fact that you can, be pretty quick, put on all that damage. I think even in competitive ogres, Mange is still very playable. If you have 10 points left over, upgrading a Noblar to Mange is just absolutely doable. So I think Mange will work its way, its little monkey way, into a whole lot of pretty solid lists, though the rest of the warband potentially not so much. If we're going to make a list with Blackpowder's Buccaneers, one that we can try is just going full theme on the pirates. Because these aren't the most competitive, the most competitive option I could think of bringing with them would be getting a lead belcher box. But then if you just only use the lead belchers in the box plus Mange, that would just be more competitive and kind of against the spirit of what we're trying to do here, which is create a cool list that's actually built around the Buccaneers as opposed to just using one model. So if I were going to do kind of a Buccaneers themed warband, I would probably get 2 man-eaters. Like I said before, Gorlock is basically a super man-eater, just a better version of what they do. You could also drop 1 man-eater for 5 Noblars and have you could probably stick on theme that way, right? The man-eaters bring so much theme on their own that you only really need 1. And then with 5 more Noblars, you could actually have a little bit more competitive setup there. It's really up to you, but that's the route I would go since these guys aren't really super competitive on their own. So my final verdict on the Buccaneers, they really are the weakest group. However, Mange is very good, and if you're kind of a competitive completionist for ogres, I would 100% get the warband just for Mange. But otherwise, if you skip it, you're not going to be hurting. The Kunnin Krew is the Cruel Boys addition to Harrowdeep, and it's pretty exciting. Let's just go down the list. So Manok, 10 points fewer than a generic Killaboss. And the trade is kind of interesting. It's something that even if they were the same cost, you'd still consider making that trade. Basically, you get 1 less toughness, but you get +1 range. Now, in terms of actual durability there, right, so the extra range means that they waste 1 action getting to you to fight you. On a high wound model, the toughness potentially is going to soak up more damage than just that 1 action would have. But it really depends on the situation and what you're fighting and, what you're getting out of that 2-inch reach, whether it's, if that's allowing you to attack over the top of a Potgrot, well, then that's much better than the 1 toughness would have been, for example. So, it really depends, but at being 10 points fewer, I would choose Manok over the generic Killaboss. The Killaboss, I think, is paying a few points for its sort of ability with the Stab Grot, and Stab Grots aren't very good. Now, Manok has this double that I don't think is very good, the Master of Mork, but it is... Here's the thing. It's rarely good. When it is good, it's very good. Being able to stop them from shooting you will potentially be very good sometimes, but in, I don't know, the vast majority of your games, you probably won't use it. Now, on to Torka, which is the really exciting thing about this warband. Torka Toughskull has 2-inch range, has not very good damage for its points, but it's enough to be relevant. And then it has a net that also has 2-inch range. And by net ability, I mean the sneaky snares. You pick a visible enemy fighter within 2 inches of this fighter and roll a dice. On a roll of 2 up, until the end of the battle round, they can't make move or disengage. So the standard net ability is a 3-up on netters, which is what all of this is named after. So doing it on a 2-up is pretty incredible. That 83% chance of success. one of the best with this ability. I mean, the obviously the contorted epitome works every time. The Bloodrack Medusa works 88% of the time instead of 83. So there are kind of other better ones, but for this just being a double, it's really amazing. It combining with the 2-inch reach is really amazing. This might be the best thing that isn't a pot grot in all of Kruleboyz. And again, like we could for the flyers, we can have a little discussion here about how, whether or not Games Workshop is kind of figuring out the mid-range problem, because this is a mid-range, mid-size fighter that is actually legitimately very attractive to use. Now, it is a defense-first fighter, and that can be a little bit of a disadvantage in a lot of missions. A lot of missions are just more heavily weighted towards offensive fighters than defensive ones. But with the new 4 rounds, that's a little more balanced than it used to be, and defense is essentially what Kruleboyz do. Really, a lot of their stuff is just really defensive. So having one of the best defensive foot fighters is kind of makes sense for them, really. Crookgrin, really interesting trade-offs here versus a normal Hoggrot. You get 2 fewer range. You get a little bit better melee profile, but you only get 8 wounds. That's really interesting, right? Because the shorter range and the better melee profile means that Crookgrin is much more up in your face than a normal Hobgrot Slitta is. The issue there is the 8 wounds make Crookgrin sort of much more vulnerable, given that it's melee focused, right? You'd rather have fewer points to get 8 wounds on regular Hobgrots and then have more points to get 10 wounds on Crookgrin. You're kind of losing the quality of life battle in both directions there. So it's fine. Crookgrin is still solid. You can shoot, you can fight decently well. Especially for the points, it's a reasonable melee attack, but it's not amazing in any kind of direction. Now, Gicket and Shank are 55 points. They have the same stat line. The difference is, well, so for one, I think that we might have a typo here. It says minion for gang up. I would assume that it's actually the warrior keyword. Now, when I say that, I mean the key rune that it takes to use the ability gang up is the minion key rune. So that says like only Gicket and Shank can use it and Crookgrin can use it, but say Torka and Manok cannot. I'm 90% sure that that is a typo, that they mean that Manok, Gicket, and Torka can use it, but Crookgrin and Shank can only benefit from it. But we don't know that, because right now, as written, it kind of makes Gicket completely useless, which is kind of funny, because they have the same stat line, but Shank has the amazing net ability that Torka has, and that's really powerful on a 55-point model. But Gicket just has nothing, because Gicket can't even use the gang up ability. Now, if you do get gang up there, that's a little bit more interesting, but I'm not super into the activate immediately abilities compared to other sorts of bonuses you can get. I just think, the only time that you actually get benefit from it is if you prevent an activation from happening because you finish something off. The thing is, the minions that could fight because of it, they don't do very much damage, so they're not often going to be getting a kill because of the ability. Now, when they do, when you take out an opposing chaff at the cost of a double, prevent it from activating, that's worth it. But that's going to happen in a minority of your games. It's going to be rare compared to, say, if you got bonus actions. That's just a much more kind of effective way to win the activation wars in Warcry. So rules as written, Gicket kind of unplayable. We could easily see an FAQ, or to be honest, they might just we haven't gotten an FAQ in this game since I was a young toddler. So we might not see an FAQ at all, and we just roll with this typo, and Gikit is sadly unplayable. Luckily, Shank and Torka are incredible in this warband, so you're okay there. If I were going to build around them, now just I'm assuming that most people who are in Cruel Boys have bought Dominion at some point, and so if you have Dominion, just pairing them with a Killaboss on Great GnashedTeeth. The disadvantages of that fighter are obviously widely celebrated, just in terms of that base just being the biggest thing in the entire world. But it's still a solid fighter in its own right, and its ability on a double is very good. And then I would just put in the Potgrot, All Hail Potgrot. The 8 points is a Potgrot hotspot, and then 3 Hobgrot Slitters. These are the little shooters, sort of a more ranged version of Crook Grin. Those are pretty solid. I've dropped Gikit here because, again, rules as written, Gikit is unplayable. Who knows if we'll ever see an FAQ. My final verdict on the Kunnin Krew, I think they're an excellent pickup. There's 2 really interesting side grades in terms of Crook Grin and Manok, where maybe they're better, maybe they're worse than the similar fighters, depending on what you're doing. But there's 2 legitimate game changers for Cruel Boys in this group. Both Torka and Shank, I think, are really amazing fighters that completely change the face of what you're doing with Cruel Boys from a competitive level, and kind of even that semi-competitive level where I'm not going to go out and sculpt 100 Potgrots from Silly Putty to put into my games, because obviously, Cruel Boys is really powerful, but very silly because no one can actually source the list that's good. But even in, let's say you have a Cruel Boys army, you bought Dominion twice to make kind of all the troops for it, and so you have 2 Potgrots, and then you've got the Kunnin Krew, and now you can actually kind of build something kind of interesting. You can do stuff like that. So there's sort of a lot that you can play around with Cruel Boys now because of the Kunnin Krew that you really couldn't before, and that's pretty exciting. So now let's get into the Exiled Dead. They're led by, I don't know exactly how I want to pronounce Daintalos the Exile, or Daintalos, who knows. Daintalos has kind of the classic issue of you have 2 decent attack profiles, meaning you have 0 good ones. It has the kind of classic unplayable mage profile, but with a strength of 6, it actually becomes extremely likely that you deal 6 damage with that ability, because, when you roll 2 dice, to have neither of them be a 1 or 2 is pretty solid chances there. So it whiffs a lot less than similar unplayable mage abilities, so it's a little bit better there. And then the melee profile, again, reasonable, but not amazing. I competitively, obviously, I don't like those types of fighters, but for casual games, I think they're fine. And you're playing Daintalos for the really good, the ability to help out its little frenzied friends there. Speaking of which, let's just skip to the frenzied Frankensteins. They're really good chaff fighters. Any non-Soulblight Gravelords faction would be thrilled to have these, or at least most of them would. I think there's really only 6 or 7 factions with better chaff fighters than this, but unfortunately one of them is Soulblight Gravelords, so competitively you can just ignore them, but they are very, very good. I think Coil is the one that's a little different. He's the one with the one giant arm that kind of spawned a lot of memes when they first showed the Exiled Dead. A lot weaker because 10 points for 1 strength is really not worth it on a cheap model. However, you'll find Coil still makes it into a lot of lists that you build with the Exiled Dead because you usually have 10 points left over. It's also so Daintalos can give them extra attacks, and that's really good. These guys kind of need it just for that crit fishing, essentially, because they do a lot when you hit a 6 and they do very little when you don't hit a 6. So having 4 attacks there is really nice, and kind of Daintalos surrounded by a bunch of them. It's kind of this self-contained combo because you just run Daedalus with his little friends, and you kind of get those extra attacks, and it's pretty solid. Then Prentice Markov and Regulus are kind of the same thing. They're just like a little synergy pair for just 105 points. Regulus is insane on his own. Prentice Markov is fine for 70 points. You know, some factions would play that stat line for 70 points and just not look back. SBG definitely not. And then, you know, it's most factions wouldn't. It's not even as good as the Frankensteins, but it's still reasonable. It's not going to be, you're not going to feel like Prentice Markov is dead weight. And Regulus is insane for 45 points. Regulus is a better zombie. It's got the same stat line except for 1 more inch of range. And Regulus also is resurrectable, which regular zombies are. But the last Underworlds warband that had skeletons, the skeletons were not resurrectable. Regulus is, which makes him really powerful and kind of an auto-include in Soulblight Gravelords. In a weird way, we need to have, once again, what these Underworlds warbands mean as far as the current thoughts on how to do points from Games Workshop. They still just don't seem to understand the issues behind having a linear pointing algorithm. Without going too into the math, basically you have a line, and each stat, its value is not the same at all points in the curve, right? And so you're valuing it the same at all times, but its in-game value differs based on what's around it, based on the context. And one of those contexts is the ability to spam something, the ability to be extremely points efficient and cheap, because an activation has inherent value that isn't being captured in your stat block points, right? So all of these cheap fighters, all of these 45, you know, everything cheaper than 50 points, really everything cheaper than 60 points, all of them are wildly undercosted just because an activation is valuable in and of itself. And so to actually have something that is better than a zombie and cheaper than a zombie, and I know why they've done it, because they've realized 3-inch move is really bad. We need to make everything with 3-inch move a lot cheaper. And that's generally true. However, all of the really small things with 3-inch move, they don't have that drawback, right? Zombies and Plague Bearers and now Regulus and even Graveguard, they can flood the board so that the 3-inch move, you don't feel it as much because you're everywhere, right? You're just taking up so much space because these little sort of your sphere of influence, right, is sort of how big your base is, and then the area around your base that you can touch, essentially. Now, 3-inch move fighters have a much smaller sphere of influence, but when there's a ton of them, those spheres overlap, and they actually cover a lot more of the board, and so the drawback of that 3-inch move is much, much smaller. Games Workshop doesn't seem to understand that. They keep, you know, they dropped the points on Plague Bearers. Now, that was fine because Demons of Nurgle, you know, they weren't exactly great before, and the Nurgle Mortals are terrible, so making a competitive Nurgle list exist now. I don't like the way they did it, but I think it's fine that they did. But making these incredibly cheap, super-powered Soulblight Gravelords 3-inch move models, I think is a huge mistake. I wish they wouldn't do it, but it's just one. It's unique. You can't spam Regulus, so it's fine. It grinds my gears, but it's not going to affect anyone who goes to a tournament. It's not an issue for anyone who actually plays the game. Just a little thing about their pointing and maybe how things are going to be for the future that I kind of worry about, probably needlessly. So let's get into list building with them. Again, because they're not the most competitive thing you can run, I would kind of go thematic with them. I would go double Underworlds, just running these guys and then getting that incredible just 4 vampire Underworlds warband, and then cutting Anais, because Anais is the weakest one, and then cutting one of the minions. They say that Dantalos is a vampire, so that it kind of fits with the other vampire crew. I know he doesn't have the same aesthetic, but let's be honest, the Exiled Dead don't have the same aesthetic as anything in the game. So what are you going to do there, right? Um, I think this would be a really cool thematic crew to run, and it's pretty cheap to get a hold of because Underworlds, you can sometimes get them for reasonable prices at your game stores. So finally, my verdict on them, they're probably the strongest warband in Harrowdeep for Warcry. Though strangely, they're one of the least relevant to their faction. There's really only one that you would run in a really competitive Soulblight Gravelords list, um, which is just kind of funny. But, Soulblight Gravelords, their theme as a faction is just being more powerful than other factions. You know, they've just got an embarrassment of riches with their options, so it's kind of no surprise that the Exiled Dead don't make a big difference there. A ton of factions, the Exiled Dead would just like completely revolutionize how you approach them from a competitive standpoint, but SBG is not one of those factions. That said, they're a really exciting and new play style. I think that's really cool. I think the fact that you get kind of two self-contained synergy groups that come here, I think is really awesome. And there is some competitive potential there. Just because it's not as powerful as, regular SBG stuff doesn't mean that you couldn't play it in a tournament. You absolutely could and win the tournament because these are really powerful fighters. They're just not the best thing that SBG can do. So getting into something that might be the best thing that its faction can do is Xandire's Truthseekers. All of them are really interesting, other than the flyer, for reasons we've talked about already. So Calthea Xandire, that's the leader, 210 points, kind of joins the Lord Imperatant and the Vigilor Prime as the kind of standout kind of potential competitive choices for Thunderstrike. Now, Vigilor Prime has a totally different role than Calthea, so I wouldn't really compare the two of them. But against the Imperatant, I think it's a really interesting comparison. So you're getting 7 fewer wounds, which is actually kind of a lot. It's sort of ganging up on Calthea and taking her down is much more doable because you're going to have multiple, probably an entire other round that it takes to take out an Imperatant. But what you get for that trade-off is +1 wound, or sorry, +1 move, which is very good, and then a tiny bit more damage. So 1 more damage against toughness 3, a third of a damage extra against toughness 5. This is once you math it out, right? Because I don't find comparing like attacks versus strength versus damage amounts to be very useful. It's better to just math it out. So the stats is a very interesting little change, sort of something that you would kind of debate. I would probably go with Calthea there on just pure stats alone. I think that +1 movement, I think, is very, very valuable. And then the +1 sort of ability to destroy toughness 3, I still really highly value that, even though the value of it has gone down with the Tome of Champions, but it's still very valuable. Now, the one thing that kind of brings it more into the Imperatant's favor, and I think makes it really more of a coin flip, is just Coordinated Strike is the Imperatant ability that kind of gives extra fun, right? Extra actions to everything nearby the Imperatant. Actions are really powerful compared to sort of reducing damage or putting on damage. Actions are just some of the best things that you can be sort of getting or doing with abilities, either taking away or giving to your own team. So I think the Imperatant's ability is significantly better than Lantern of Astrala. However, depending on the metagame situation, I mean, there are times when the Lantern is going to be really, really good. So I think Calthea definitely kind of sticks around there, even though I would personally choose the Imperatant. It's very close. Now, Doraz Giantfell, really interesting piece there. Solid combat fighter, kind of interesting with abilities, right? Staggering Blow can just be hilariously bad for you to use. There's a lot of times when giving someone a free disengage can just let them go do something very important to the mission. So definitely don't do it when that could happen. Otherwise, it can be very good for keeping Doraz alive. I do think a lot of the time you really want actually to kind of keep them around fighting him long term, because I think a lot of opponents are going to want to avoid fighting Doraz, but that doesn't mean there aren't legitimate times when you want to do that, right? Attacking twice and then forcing a disengage to make them use an entire action to get back on you to attack you once again. That's obviously powerful, very powerful in any kind of 1v1 situation. I just don't think Warcry often shakes out that way. And a lot of the time your opponent would rather be fighting someone else other than Doraz. So a lot of the time you're helping them with that. That said, this is a really solid, if you've got extra points, and you were going to take a sword, regular sword guy from Thunderstrike, I think Doraz is an awesome thing to do with that upgraded 15 extra points that you might have. So definitely kind of a thing to always keep your eye on as a worthy include in the faction. Luxa Stormrider, I think, is really interesting, right? Exact same profile as a Vigilor, but has an extra ability and is 15 fewer points. Now, you already consider using Vigilors in your lists if you're not going to use a Vigilor Prime, for example, just because Guided Lightning is such a powerful ability. So having that Vigilor that you were already using anyway for 15 fewer points is amazing. Now, I would suggest always having a Vigilor Prime as your leader in Thunderstrike. But now that Luxa exists, I think it's pretty reasonable to go with an Imperatant or Calthea instead, just because you're getting that ability for such a cheaper thing. I would personally probably still rather lean Vigilor Prime, but I think it's very understandable to skip one now and go with Luxa. The triple Quick Volley, adding 2 to the attack's characteristic, does make you have a pretty darn good attack from Luxa. It's still usually going to be inferior to Guided Lightning because if it's a really important target, you're probably trying to get other attacks onto it already. Guided Lightning gives 1 attack for Luxa and then +1 attack for someone else who hopefully has a better attack on it, or say could potentially even get +3 attacks, +4 attacks, depending if other things are fighting it. It's also, Guided Lightning is an amazing combo if you bring Gryph-hounds, because they get that extra attack ability with darting attack. So you can potentially just get +1 for Luxa and then +3 because your Gryph-hound is attacking 3 times. So Guided Lightning is amazing is really all I'm saying, and Luxa being able to give you access to it for 15 fewer points is just like a no-brainer in the faction. Taros, same problem as Screech. Basically the same profile as an Aetherwing, but nearly double the price. It's anyone who's been building their warband on exclusively flyers, definitely take note of these points changes, because I would bet the next Tome of Champions is going to be pretty cruel for you. So if I'm building around the Truthseekers, I would just do Truthseekers plus a pack of Gryph-hounds. Gryph-hounds are obviously amazing. They're kind of one of the best fighters in Stormcast. I know a lot of people don't like Gryph-hound spam lists because it doesn't feel like you're playing Stormcast. I think you would feel like you're playing Stormcast in this list, because it's basically you'd have 1 Gryph-hound in each deployment group, and then each Gryph-hound would have their Stormcast assigned to it, and so they'd be like your little pets. I think it'd be really cool. You get a lot out of it. Calthea, Luxia, and Doraz, all 3 of them use doubles. This is assuming you're using Guided Lightning instead of the triple for Luxa. So all 3 of them use doubles for their abilities, which is great because that means if you roll a triple, you're not fighting for dice with the Gryph-hounds. Obviously, the Gryph-hounds have one of the best triples in the game, getting to have extra attacks and extra disengages. So these fighters just synergize really, really nicely with those Gryph-hounds, right? They're not fighting for space at all, which means this warband, I'm not going to say it's the best thing you can do in Thunderstrike, but it's up there, and I think that's part of what's so cool about this warband is that they've come in at this exact point where they are equal to, but not necessarily better than, the best things you can do in Thunderstrike, which is like the most perfect balance point that you could possibly ask for. And it means that a really dedicated sort of, if someone really loves the faction and they're willing to test out and mix and match these sort of new powerful options, you can get to something that works really, really well for you, and you're not as as kind of pigeonholed if you want kind of competitive options, because you've essentially doubled the amount of competitive fighters in Thunderstrike with just one release, and I think that's awesome. So I just love seeing these here. That's it for the new warbands in Harrowdeep. I think this is actually really good news for all 4 of the factions. Thunderstrike, obviously all 3 of these being very, very good in that faction. The Exiled Dead obviously being incredible, even if Soulblight Gravelords will probably only use one of them. The Cruel Boys getting 2 just like totally revolutionary fighters for what that faction does. And then even the Buccaneers, they're not as good, but you'd still be pretty tempted to pick up Mange if you're trying to get competitive with ogres. So just an awesome release for lovers of any of these 4 factions, and it makes me really look forward to every single new warband that comes with Underworlds, because I just keep thinking, you know, you have better than coin flip odds that it adds a lot to your favorite faction if you get one of these warbands from Underworlds, which I think is a great place to be in. So now that these have come out, I can actually kind of go forward making lists for all these factions for my starter list series. So I'm going to be probably working on that pretty exclusively for the next few weeks. So until those come out, may all your rolls be crits.